What's up with liberal Christianity? That is, liberal as in gay pride flag waving Christianity. As a kid, the idea that this was even a thing was totally foreign to me. It was taught very clearly that I believed very clearly that the Bible said these things are wrong, and if you want to be a Christian, you have to believe in the Bible. So, how could someone even endorse this and claim to be a Christian? Not only that, how could someone create a church claiming that this sort of stuff was okay? My first introduction to this sort of thing is when I was relatively young. I remember going to a church, I don't think it was one that I attended regularly, and the pastor gave a sermon on how he used to be gay, and he attended a church that affirmed that sort of thing. But now he was no longer of that persuasion, and he was now the pastor of this church. The entire concept baffled me. I didn't even understand how you could be a church and allow that. I was a kid. I was, I don't know, no older than 10. And the idea that different Protestants had vast disagreements on theology was entirely foreign to me. I thought we all just believed what the Bible said. So the idea that other churches could have different interpretations of the verses pertaining to those types of sexual acts was entirely foreign. Eventually, though, as I got older, I did look into the history and the current state of churches in my country, Canada, and around the Western world, and I eventually did discover that Protestants had vast disagreements among each other. And one of the most disturbing things I found out was not only were there many churches that held to this sort of liberal Christianity that I had a brief introduction to in my youth, these churches were in fact the largest churches in Canada, at least in terms of total members. The two biggest being the United Church of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada, both of which are liberal in all the ways you would expect. They have female clergy, they are pro-LGBT, they're pro-choice, all those types of things. And they're also, of course, very committed to whatever the current left-wing culture war issue is. Whether it's BLM, whether it's indigenous issues, they're always at the forefront. Of course, the Baptist and other various evangelical churches I went to growing up certainly weren't ultra conservative. I don't remember any fiery speeches about sexual issues or talks about abortion, maybe ever. But they were at least generally conservative. They did at least generally affirm the conservative positions you'd assume. And they did have the occasional left wing culture push. In particular, I remember from many different churches hearing the same old speech about how we're probably racist because we don't have enough non white people in our congregation. This fairly middle of the road, moderately conservative Christianity is just what I kind of assumed it was generally like. I did, of course, see on the news every once in a while stuff about some crazy pastor in America that really hated some group of people, but I figured, for whatever reason, that my experiences were generally representative. So, discovering that the biggest churches in my country were very left wing, that this wasn't just a phenomena in a couple of churches, that this was a very mainstream concept, was very shocking to me. Now, I could be overblowing this a little bit. I'm not trying to say that the majority of church going Christians in Canada are super progressive. I doubt that's the case. This is, at least in part, a split between mainline and evangelical churches. That is, mainline churches, the old historic churches that have large organizations, tend to be more progressive, while evangelical churches, which are relatively newer and which are much more decentralized, tend to be much more conservative. So if you just look at the largest organizations, it's a bit less of a shock that you find a lot of progressive groups, but if you walk into your local evangelical church, they're probably at least relatively conservative, the type of conservative I was describing before. That split is not complete. There are conservative mainline churches and there are liberal evangelical churches, but that's how it tends to work out, both in Canada, the US, and I'd assume other Western countries, but I can't confirm that. This, of course, eventually led me to look into what was it exactly that these churches used to justify their seemingly heretical viewpoints. I won't go into depth here, this isn't a theology channel, but the basic justification is quibbling over what specifically was it that St. Paul meant when he talked about various types of sexual immorality, along with some other parts of the Bible too. The re-understandings of these verses did not particularly convince me, and this was one of the major events that made me have a lot less faith in the Protestantism that I grew up with. What is it exactly that led these churches to get to this point, and how are they doing currently? Well, on that latter point, I can report with a little bit of satisfaction that the most liberal churches tend to be those which are dying the fastest. In Canada, you can see this very clearly. As I said, the largest two churches, both very progressive, is the United Church of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada. From 2001 to 2011, the most recent census data that we have on the question, the United Church of Canada has lost almost a third of their members, from 2.8 million to 2 million, and the Anglican Church has similarly lost about 400,000 of their members, from 2 million to 1.6 million. Now, of course, it could be alleged that that's just a part of the larger decline of Christianity in the West, and it doesn't have anything to do with those churches in particular. But if you look into the specifics of other churches, you really just don't see the same phenomena with more conservative churches. Now, I'm not saying that they're exploding. I'm not saying that the based Baptists are about to take over Canada, but they at least seem to have relatively constant numbers of members. Of course, as immigration rates continue to drive the population of Canada and other countries up, maintaining constant numbers means that you'll be a smaller section of the entire country. But comparing that to a church which lost a third of its members in a decade, that is at least a bit of a difference. In the United States, you can see pretty similar trends. In 2001, the Episcopalian Church, one of the most progressive churches in America, had 3.4 million members. Well, by 2008, they had only 2.4 million, that is, a loss of 1 million. Similarly, the Methodists, who are also pretty left-wing, though perhaps not quite as bad, had 14 million members in 2001 and are down to 11 million in 2008. And if you compare that to Baptists in the US over the same period, they gained about 2.5 million members. Now, again, I don't want anyone to feel too triumphalist here. None of this is to say that the based Christians are taking over and that the lefties are all just waning. The reality is, of course, America and the West in general is getting much, much less religious, but clearly among those who choose to remain members of organized religion, the conservative churches are doing much better than the progressive ones. How is it that there are so many progressive churches, though, in the first place? How did this all come to be? Well, that's of course a very big question, and I certainly cannot answer it entirely. But if you look throughout the West, again, particularly North America, in the past 100 years, there's been many ecumenical movements. Now, that is of course not inherently wrong, but if you look at the history of these movements, the issue is they aren't like the Council of Nicaea. They're not trying to help define the faith and unite it. They're trying to just flatten over the differences that already exist. One of the most successful in these movements was actually, again, in Canada, and resulted in the United Church of Canada. This was, as the name would suggest, a unification of several different churches, four in particular: the Methodist Church Canada, the Congregational Union of Ontario and Quebec, 2/3 of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and the Association of Local Union Churches. They came together in 1925 and formed the United Church. They were also joined in 1968 by the Evangelical United Brethren Church. If you know just a bit about the basics of theology of various Protestant groups, the uniting of those 5 different churches should sound at least a little odd. All of those churches have quite diverse theology from one another, and expecting them all to get along together would seem a bit odd. But as I said, this has been a part of a quite long-running ecumenical impulse that's been going on throughout the West. And the issue with this impulse is that it just flattens beliefs. When many different churches are forced to unite, they give up the differences, the in many cases meaningful differences, that used to divide them. But they don't keep to any of those differences. They just have a vague, watered-down, supposed Christianity. The image I have in the background is quite instructive for this. The Descent of the Modernists by a fundamentalist Christian, back when that was a label that people would commonly apply to themselves. The only issue with it is it seems to be going a bit quick. The top step is Christianity, and then Bible not infallible, man not made in God's image, no miracles, no virgin birth, etc. The reality is, between Christianity and Bible not infallible, there's a couple more steps, and this ecumenism, this flattening of beliefs, is one of those steps. If the differences that divide existing Christians don't really matter, then which beliefs are it exactly that do matter? That's a very serious question, and not a very easy one to answer, and it's the sort of thing that can lead to quite rapid change. What exactly are the core values that matter? This is a very serious question, and not one that's very easy to answer if you just flatten the differences between various Christian groups. We've seen this play out quite clearly in the United Church over the past couple of years. That is because one of their churches is led by an explicitly atheist pastor. The person in question is Greta Vosper, and in 2016 the church had decided that they wanted to get rid of her, but they changed their decision in 2018 and decided that she was allowed to stay. This article from Global News is really hilarious with how they put it. The leader of the United Church, Richard Bott, quote-unquote, referenced the church's core values of faith in God and inclusiveness. He says, "The dance between these core values, how they interact and inform each other, is one which we continue to explore as followers of Jesus and the children of the Creator." Yes, his faith in God is being explicitly equated with his faith in inclusiveness. And as I've heard some progressive Christians say about the situation, who are we to fire Vosper? Wouldn't that be against religious liberty? Now, that is all obviously insane. However, the progression from what's really the difference between Presbyterians and Methodists, and what's really the difference between Christians and atheists, is not a totally illogical progression. Thank you very much for watching. Please donate to my Subscribestar or Patreon if you enjoy this content, or check out my Teespring. And please like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, and share these videos with anyone who you think might find it interesting. And a special thanks to my donors, Emmett Vestry, Lita, Seth Apex, King of Evil Florida and the Moon, Josiah, Adzutko, Hexorius, Quo Pregrenitor, and Charismatic Byzantine. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.